Good morning. The 7,481st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Zaid Raad Al Hussein, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome Mr. Al Hussein, who is joining today's meeting via video teleconference from Geneva. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to warmly welcome the Deputy Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Jan Eliasson, and I now give him the floor.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, one of the greatest missions of the United Nations is the prevention of genocide. The horrors of the past and the dangers of the present remind us of the importance of this mission. The genocide at Srebrenica was one of the darkest chapters in recent history. In 3 days, family and community members, faith leaders, dignitaries, and representatives from around the world will gather in Srebrenica to honor the victims. I will travel there to represent the United Nations on behalf of the Secretary General. Today, we meet here in New York to pay our respect to all victims and to share in the grief of the affected families and communities. We gather in humility and regret to recognize the failure of the United Nations and the international community to prevent this tragedy. But we also meet to proclaim our determination that the lessons learned from those unspeakable days in July 1995 must help us detect the dangers earlier. We must build an organization that is better equipped to keep such crimes and atrocities from reoccurring. The United Nations has acknowledged its responsibility for failing to protect the people who sought shelter and relief in Srebrenica. The 1999 report of the Secretary General to the General Assembly identified the mistakes committed by the organization and by the wider international community. That same year, the independent inquiry into the actions of the United Nations during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda found similar deficiencies. We have since then worked in many ways to implement the recommendations of the reports. Prevention has become an imperative. A special advisor on the prevention of genocide has been appointed. International criminal tribunals have brought perpetrators of heinous crimes to justice. The 2005 General Assembly endorsement of the responsibility to protect made the prevention of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity a core state and international responsibility. Peacekeepers are now regularly provided with robust mandates to protect civilians. They are often authorized to use all necessary means in defense of populations. But peacekeepers continue to face many of the same challenges that plagued the United Nations in Srebrenica, not least paralyzing divisions among member states and a lack of political and material support. The Human Rights Upfront initiative is generating structural changes inside the organization, which aim to improve our efforts to take early preventive action. The special advisors on the prevention of genocide and on the responsibility to protect have developed a framework of analysis for atrocity crimes, a useful tool to assess risks and develop prevention strategies. The United Nations and its member states, as well as regional organizations, have an obligation to strengthen our collective prevention efforts and to find peaceful solutions in the spirit of Chapter 6 and Chapter 8 of the UN Charter. Mr. President, the Security Council has a central role to play. We see today how situations can deteriorate and get out of control when the Council is divided. The carnage in Syria has undoubtedly taken a toll on the reputation and standing of the Council and the United Nations. Atrocious crimes are today also taking place in Iraq, South Sudan, and elsewhere. Extremist groups like ISIL, Boko Haram, and Al-Shabaab are seemingly competing in brutality with the aim of spreading fear and divisions among populations. As the Charter and as morality direct us, we must unite our strength against such atrocious acts and threats. When we are running out of words in our outrage, we have to take action and live up to basic values and principles. All of us share the same objective, to work towards a world which has finally learned the horrific lessons of the past and where people can live in peace and dignity, as is their right and aspiration. The world looks to us here at the United Nations and to the UN Security Council and expects us to uphold that right and to meet those aspirations. That is our shared responsibility today, and it is how we can best pay homage to the victims of Srebrenica. I thank you.
I thank the Deputy Secretary-General for his statements. I now give the floor to Mr. Zaid Rahad Al Hussein.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the sound of mass murder in war is not the howling of machine guns or popping of sidearms. The real sound of an act of genocide, the sound of Srebrenica that I heard years ago, was the dull, low moaning of 10,000 and more living victims of genocide, all the mothers, the sisters and daughters of the murdered 8,000 boys and men. How could we, all of us in the UN at the time, have been so foolish as not to anticipate their murder? How could we have made so many mistakes and still today not properly understand them, nor even have taken the right corrective measures to avoid their repetition? 1 week ago, the Hague Institute for Global Justice and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum organized a discussion that brought together for the first time many of the key officials connected to the events 20 years ago in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and especially Srebrenica. Our task was to piece together in detail what happened from the formation of UNPROFOR in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1992 to the fall of Srebrenica and the mass murder that ensued, with the help of recently declassified documents as well as materials from the relevant trials at the ICTY. Allow me to briefly narrate some of the key events. Early in 1993, the Bosnian Deputy Prime Minister, Hakija Turajlic, was shot and killed by Bosnian Serb soldiers at a checkpoint outside Sarajevo while riding in a UN armored personnel carrier. The UN watched the killing haplessly. In one sudden, bloody stroke, it lost the respect of both sides to the conflict. When General Morion placed Srebrenica under the protection of the UN 2 months later, this restored some credibility to the force, but it also showed UNPROFOR to be operating in its own orbit, unguided by New York. Security Council Resolution 836 subsequently gave UNPROFOR that guidance and some leverage too by providing a stick, that is, the authority to take the necessary measures, including the use of force, NATO air power, in reply to bombardments against the 6 safe areas. This stick was used successfully in February 1994 when the UN used the threat of NATO air power to oblige the Serbs to cease their pounding of Sarajevo. And yet, this stick was then dropped by UNPROFOR during the Gorazde crisis in April 1994, when the UN Secretary General, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, the SRSG, and the UNPROFOR commander in Bosnia and Herzegovina, General Michael Rose, were not eager to use the threat of force and settled only for close air support, a limited action solely in defense of the UN. They were concerned by the apparent contradiction of having blue-helmeted troops take sides in a conflict. Yet, by not taking sides, when the conflict was so obviously one-sided, with an aggressor and a clear victim, the UN appeared to many to be doing just that, siding with the aggressor. The UN's hesitation to use NATO air power meant the Bosnian Serb leadership could push on an open door. Whenever in 1994 UNPROFOR came under attack in one of the 6 designated safe areas and requested close air support from NATO, leading to what was described as pinprick attacks, the Bosnian Serb leadership took UN personnel as hostages. This caused even more vacillation in the UN, prompting the Bosnian Serb leadership to exert even greater levels of pressure. The UN simply became reactive, especially after the collapse of the Vance-Owen plan in 1993. Only on the 24th and 25th of May 1995 did this change. Following the withdrawal of heavy weapons from the UN weapon collection sites around Sarajevo, a new UNPROFOR commander more disposed to the use of air power warned both sides to return their weapons. The Bosnian Serbs were slow to comply, and airstrikes, as opposed to close air support, were ordered. The next day, the Bosnian Serbs bombed Tuzla, leading to a second set of NATO airstrikes on Bosnian Serb targets. This prompted, in turn, the taking of some 400 UN peacekeepers hostage. Soon after, the US, together with the UK and France, decided to suspend the use of airstrikes. The stage was set for Srebrenica. Earlier, on the 8th of March, Radovan Karadzic had approved his Directive 7, ordering the Bosnian Serb army to squeeze the eastern enclaves, including Srebrenica, and I quote, to create an unbearable situation with no hope of survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica and Jepa, end quote. Together with this pause in the use of airstrikes coming into being in the first days of June, a door clicked open and the hand of Ratko Mladic swung towards it. On the 3rd of June, the Bosnian Serbs attacked observation post Echo on the edge of the Srebrenica safe area, found little resistance, and took over the post. It was the litmus test for what was to come. The following day, on the 4th of June, Ratko Mladic met with the overall UN commander, General Bernard Janvier, and came away with the impression the UN would not use NATO air power so long as the Bosnian Serbs refrained from threatening UN personnel. 1 month later, as the Bosnian Serb army advanced on Srebrenica from the southeast, there were 2 requests for close air support from Dutchbat on the 6th and the 8th of July, respectively. Both of them were denied, even though Resolution 836 had been clearly violated. When Mladic saw there was minimal resistance, he decided on the 9th to take the town. On the 10th, the Dutch set up a blocking position, which, if overrun, the UN warned, would trigger a NATO response. But when General Janvier spoke to General Tolomir on the evening of the 10th to demand that the Bosnian Serb soldiers immediately halt their firing, Janvier telegraphed in his choice of words his reluctance to use air power. On the 11th, the NATO aircraft were flying over Srebrenica actually began to overrun the UN blocking position at 10 a.m., did Janvier present his request to SRSG Akashi, who approved it. But there was a condition attached to the order. Air power could only be used against the actual weapons system firing on the UN blocking system. So not only was it all too late, but also too little. The safe area was seized. On the night of the 11th, Ratko Mladic began the process of transforming that military victory into a crime on a scale not seen in Europe since 1945. It was apparently on that night that he took the decision to execute the 1,000 boys and men gathered in Potocari. The mass executions began on the 13th, and realizing that they had been undetected by the UN, the killers continued their work until over 8,000 hors de combat boys and men were dead. In the years since then, while many of us have been haunted by these events, there was never a proper discussion about them at the UN, beyond one perfunctory debate in the General Assembly in 1999. That UNPROFOR had a clumsy mandate in the beginning was abundantly clear, and it was obvious that two cultures, the UN and NATO, operated together with some confusion. Still, those boys and men may well have lived had the UNPROFOR Chief of Staff in Sarajevo actually approved the request for close air support, or had the UN used airstrikes in line with Resolution 836 on the 3rd of June, when the attack on observation post Echo took place, or on the 6th of July, when the advance against Srebrenica began, or on the 8th, or if General Janvier had approved them on the 10th, or earlier on the morning of the 11th. And the deeper lessons for the UN are as relevant today as they were 20 years ago. Our inability to anticipate events so prevalent then is still with us today, and our recurrent failure to understand with whom and with what we are dealing. Even after the events earlier in the war, in Cluj, Kotovaros, Prijedor, Sanski Most, none of us believed that Mladic could be so brazen as to commit genocide when the UN was there in Bosnia and Herzegovina in great numbers. We got it wrong, so wrong, although the people of Srebrenica knew full well who they were confronted with and what was in store for them. We simply had not stopped to think about these issues in sufficient depth. Perhaps we could say the same thing about the international community's approach to the political crisis in July 2013 in Juba, given what unfolded subsequently in South Sudan. All too often in UNPROFOR, we lurched almost mindlessly from crisis to crisis, and still today the UN seems to skate over the surface of many of the conflicts on its agenda. Moreover, UNPROFOR feared the Bosnian Serbs. We in UNPROFOR did not even allow for the possibility they could also have feared or learned to fear us. We were often timid and readily communicated this impression. The most foundational lesson of Srebrenica was this: to succeed, the UN must be respected. For the UN to be effective in robust peacekeeping, all the parties to the conflict, and in particular the aggressor, must take the measure of this Council, its decisions, and the UN presence on the ground. They must believe there will be serious consequences and no impunity. We also too often crossed the line from needing to understand the grievances of the oppressor to then almost showing sympathy with them. And this, to me, was and is exceedingly dangerous. More alarmingly, we perceived the complexity of the political scene, but then made the mistake of believing what was complicated politically must also be complicated morally. It was not. That all sides committed crimes was true, but this did not mean all sides were equally guilty, not when scale and proportion were factored in. In the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the moral picture was actually very straightforward for anyone who wanted to see it. General Rupert Smith, the single most influential UN commander who brought the fighting in Bosnia and Herzegovina to an end in 1995, today argues persuasively that commanders of UN operations must command and others must do the negotiating. If not, when they are faced with an assault on their mandate or personnel or on civilians, the commanders or the SRSG will have nothing to offer in negotiations except the mission itself. Again, so long as there is no respect for the UN, it would be likely that further massacres will be perpetrated. At the very least, if the UN is to make good on its commitment to protect civilians, it must be resolute, undivided, and clear about its intention. Had this been the case with Sri Lanka in 2009, or now in Sudan, Syria, Central African Republic, or even Burundi and Myanmar, the consequences for the lives of millions of people would be immense. I also believe that it is clear from the 1999 Srebrenica report that the safe area concept can work, but only if implemented properly. I believe it should be examined very thoroughly for possible application in some of today's crises where the acute suffering of innocent people reminds us of the thousands of families weeping hauntingly for the men and boys of Srebrenica whom they would never see again. Srebrenica was a catastrophe for its inhabitants and refugees huddled there on the 11th of July 1995, and also for the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina and for the UN. It is a trauma from which we could still learn with great remorse. For many of us who served with the UN in the former Yugoslavia, Srebrenica will remain for many years the heart that breaks daily. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Al Hussein